this seminar. I have the great pleasure of introducing Marina Bertolini. Marina is a young scientist with a very bright future. She works at the University of Sao Paulo, along with a colleague of mine, Professor Adelaide Nardoci, who is professor at the University of Sao Paulo. Professor Nardoci and I are co-PIs for a large Belmont Forum project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation in the US, for PESP in Brazil, and the UKRI in the UK. This project has partners in Africa, in Tanzania and Ethiopia. We've got partners in India. And Marina's work is located within the segment that focus on flood risk. She applies a nexus framework to her research, and in doing so, we hope that Marina will be able to flesh out and articulate more clearly the links to policy. And although I'm an ISS alumni, I thought it would be a good idea to actually promote and encourage Marina's work, and that was why I requested Sarah to make a slight detour from the original plan. And I'm grateful to Sarah and to Dita for making those minor adjustments so that Marina can present today. And I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion and to hearing the comments of the discussants. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And just before we begin with Marina's presentation, I would like to ask Dita to introduce Savenji. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Although according to Shakespeare, good wine needs no bush, it is still with a lot of fun and also a great honor for me to introduce to you my friend and teacher, Professor Huub Savenije. In Mozambique, in another life, he taught me the tricks of an electric typewriter, how to use Tipex, and subsequently made me the water project secretary. This introduced me to the world of office work, a world I had until then desperately tried to stay away from. But somehow Huub made me see the fun of it. He took me on field trips in the Boston Whaler to the Indian Ocean and the estuaries of the Zambezi River. He introduced me to the phenomenon of saline intrusion, hydrological systems, rainfall and flood models, but all in a remarkably digestible, simple and enthusiastic manner. Huub is able to simplify water and its complex behavior. Huub, in fact, is water, and he loves it. His natural talent as teacher must have seeped through to the Royal Palace here in The Hague. And somehow he was made the personal water management trainer of our present king, William Alexander. And so ends the story of the professor, the king, and the secretary. And let us quickly start with the webinar now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Marina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dita, and thank you, Matthew, for the presentation. So can you just confirm to me if you are seeing my screen?
Beautifully.
Okay, thank you. So as previous mentioned, I will talk a little bit about how the flood event can impact also the sanitation systems and what is the final risk that this presents to the health and the well-being of the population. And I'm going to present a little bit about the Brazilian context. So it's important for us to know a little bit about the background in Brazil. We have this picture here is the reality of that we have in the city of São Paulo, and I think it's also kind of the same for other developing countries in tropical areas. We have cities with a lot of social contradictions, where we have areas with a good urban planning and covered by good infrastructures, but at the same time we have large areas of irregular occupation that lacks of services on urban drainage, waste, sewage collection, and also are really social and economical fragile. And at the same time, in these tropical cities, it is common to have these heavy storm events with a high rainfall intensity and a volume in a short period of time that leads to flash flood events. And this is what we see after these events occur. We have huge damage in the urban infrastructure, pipeline ruptures, disruption of services, economic losses, and even injury and death of the population. And another important impact that we have is the contamination of the urban rivers that can happen due to the deficit in the waste collection services, which makes the waste being washed by the rain and transported to the rivers. And we also have an overflow of the sewage facilities. We can note that the flood risk and their impact for the population depends on many different factors and causes. And we have an interconnection with the different systems. So once we lack sanitation systems, we'll have amplified risk to contamination of the population during flood events. And at the same time, the absence of waste collection will even make it bigger, the probability of a flood occurring. Therefore, they cannot just be seen from an isolated perspective. It is necessary to deal with these risks in a systematic and holistic view, which can be supported by the Nexus approach. So in this case here, we are going to lead with two main nexus, the poverty flood risk nexus and also the water, sanitation, and health nexus. And it is important for us to train the resiliency of the cities and communities to these risks imposed by the extreme events. So first of all, what is resilience? How can we define resilience? The United Nations define resiliency as the ability of a system or community to anticipate, resist, prepare, respond, and recover from an event with multiple risks with the least possible harm to social, economical, and environmental well-being. But how can we determine and quantify the resiliency of a given system? Currently, there are different indexes that have been developed to quantify the resiliency, and in general, they incorporate variables representing the relation between the susceptibility of a system with the actions taken to manage the risk. So it can be defined as a function that correlates the risk analysis and the risk management. So it is important also for us to define what is risk and what is risk management, and how can we deal with this both factors. So the susceptibility of the system can be quantified by a function that correlates the probability of occurrence of the event, that is also called by hazard, the vulnerability of the different components of the system to the risk itself, and also the level of exposure of the system to a given risk. So it is a function that takes into account the hazard, the vulnerability, and exposure. And we have multiple variables that represent the vulnerability and exposure. And in the case of the health, of the water, sanitation, and health nexus, we are going to discuss what are these vulnerability and exposure variables later. And as for the risk management, there are different approaches that have been used in the international community over the years. And the first one was about just dealing with the disaster management, and it was about the organizing, planning, and applicate measures to prepare, respond, and recover for a disaster. And this approach didn't necessarily incorporate actions to avert or eliminate the threat. So recently, there is a different approach that has been used in the Sendai framework to disaster risk reduction that is about disaster risk management, actually. So it applies disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risks, reduce the existing disaster risks, and manage the residual risk. So contributing to strengthening the resiliency and the reduction of disaster losses. And these actions must be taken in different time scales and with a final focus on increasing the economical, the social, the health, and the environmental resilience. So it's from this approach that we are going to continue our work here. So here is just a general framework that we are adopting in our work to the resilience assessment. And one of the important aspects of this framework is that it's evaluated in a multi-stage. So it's composed by a risk estimation and a risk management evaluation in separate steps. So we can have a deeper understanding of these two aspects. And it's important to highlight also the dynamic aspect of this process. So we have here an arrow that do the reevaluation and the optimization of the system. And this dynamic aspect is important because it allows to take into account the boundary conditions of the local and political and institutional structure that we have for each of the 5 bands, and how we can deal with these boundary conditions through the time, and allowing us to reevaluate the scenarios and then optimize the resilience for the given conditions that we have in the current scenario. To support our resilience assessment, we have proposed a causal loop diagram to identify how the different components of the systems interact with each other. So here I'm presenting a little bit of the general image of the causal loop diagram that we have constructed for the water, sanitation, and health nexus in the context of the Brazilian megacities. And it's like, it's super confusing. Causal loop diagrams are super complex, so I'm not going to go to each of these boxes and arrows and paths. But the important to know is that it allows us to evaluate and to identify what are the reinforcement paths and inhibitor paths. And with this, we can see what are the main factors and main process that causes vulnerability and exposure of the population, and also what are the different contributions that the risk management actions will have to each of this biophysical process. So it allows us to identify what are the trade-offs and the synergies between these political institutional actions with the biophysical condition of our system. So here we have identified as the main impact in this causal loop diagram as from the extreme precipitation events, as the landslides and flash floods, the sewage overflow, the contamination of surface water, and the infrastructure damage. These impacts can lead to final risk to the population by injuries and death. That would be the main final risk, but also from disease dissemination, such as chikungunya, dengue, diarrhea, and other diseases, the disruption of water supply, or even access to water with less quality. And the details of these impacts can be discussed later in the Q&A session. So the risk management actions to flood impacts. Okay, on water and sanitation health nexus, they can have 2 main approaches: the decrease of flood risk itself, or improve water supply and sanitation system coverage. From the decrease on flood risk itself, we have some example of actions like household regularization, land use control, great green infrastructure, among others. And from the improved water supply and sanitation system, some examples are politics for sanitation universalization, water law and water policy, among others. But the importance of identify these risk management actions is so we can allow to see what are the trade-offs between these actions and the system itself. So here we have an extensive but non-exhaustive list of trade-offs, but I would like to focus a little bit on these 3 main trade-offs that concern urban planning. That is household regularization that can lead to valorization of houses and can push low-income communities to other fragile areas. Also, the unsheltered population can contribute to new irregular occupations. And when we have politics of land use control with maximum occupation percentage, we can contribute also to expand the urban area, and because it will decrease the population density. So this kind of adverse effects that the politics of urban control can have, it's important for us to take into account when we are dealing with risk management actions. But also we can have some synergies. And some of them is that the sanitation universalization can contribute to increase health and social conditions. The green and gray infrastructure can contribute to decrease economical losses due to floods. And the green infrastructures can also increase the alternative water supply to non-potable demand. And the flood insurance, they can also help to fund flood prevention measures. We have also made some analysis about the SDGs, trade-offs between them, but we can go from this later, and I can also share the final paper that we are going to submit the end of this month with you to see a little bit of that. And it is also important for us to, just to finalize, mention a little bit about the other step that we have in the resilience assessment, that is to quantify the risk in the different locations. So in order to model this risk, we have identified the variables that represent the vulnerability and exposure factors of the area that are related to flood, sanitation, and public health. So examples of these vulnerability variables are the land use, the declivity, the coverture of the sanitation services, the household income. And for exposure, for example, we have population density, the extent of the flood map, the elevation of the infrastructure. And these variables can be then correlated and classified in one single map of risk, one single final risk map. And it's important for us when we are dealing with evidence-based decision making that these risk and these vulnerability and exposure variables can be translated in one final communication that is easy to read and easy to understand by the public stakeholders and even the community. So that's why we have chosen to present this risk information in math. So I would like to thank you all for the attention. I know that we have just a little short time, and I'll be here to the quick questions and answer sessions and discussions about our approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marina. Perfect timing. I am now going to pass it to Sailaja, who's going to give her presentation, and then we will hear from both of the discussants and then open it up to the floor. For all of those who are interested in making comments, please begin to put your comments in the chat and I will collect them. So Sailaja, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dita, and thank you, Professor Tanka, for agreeing to be the discussant. It's a pleasure to be back to Pilani. I'm sorry, it's a pleasure to be back to ISS, although online. It's a, I'm kind of nervous also. It's been several years. I haven't shared a word with some of you people, so it's quite nice a feeling. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you once again for inviting me. So since there are some connectivity issues, I'm going to use my audio and the PPT. And with your permission, I'm minimizing my video, if that is all right. I'll start my PowerPoint in a minute. I hope you can see this.
Perfectly. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So today I'm going to present this particular topic, which is the responsibilization in natural resource governance. And I'm asking a particular question. Does responsibilization lead to better forest management under Forest Rights Act? And this particular paper is an offshoot of a project that was concluded recently. And the funding comes from the ICSSR, Indian Council for Social Science Research of India. And without any further ado, I'll continue with the presentation. I'm planning to cover as much as I can among this list of topics I have included, but because of the time paucity, I could skip one or two of these aspects for practicality reasons. So the background of the study, methodology we followed, and introduction to the Forest Rights Act, of course, a brief history of Indian forest policy, and the main Forest Rights Act components, which are individual and collective forest rights. And we talk about some of the trade-offs, some conflicts and cooperation synergies, as well as trade-offs. And we will also talk about some of the effects on forest cover, as well as on the participating communities, before we conclude with the discussion of future of the Forest Rights Act and the forest dependent communities in India. So Forest Rights Act is a response of the Indian government to the civil society's demands of undoing the injustice done to the forcibly evicted tribes and the other traditional forest dwellers What does this mean? This means that the entire generation of forest dwellers, including the tribes and the non-tribes people who otherwise were forcibly evicted or were denied of their rights to access forests, were now supposed to be given their due and were now supposed to be given their user rights so that they can live with their bona fide livelihoods. So there are four types of rights, that are given under the Forest Rights Act. One is individual forest rights, second is community forest rights, third and fourth are not very important at this stage, although they're supposed to be very significant. Since there is not much implementation, we will be talking less about this in our presentation. The last two rights, community forest resource rights as well as habitat rights, which are affecting the semi-nomad and pastoralist communities, are not yet under full operation. So we will be concentrating on individual and community forest rights for this presentation. So a quick background of Forest Rights Act and where all we have done our field work. We selected 3 states of India, Telangana, Gujarat, and West Bengal. And as you can see, the forest rights cells are formulated at the district levels of each of the states. And these district level offices cells are responsible for carrying out the implementation. And of course, the individual and community forest rights claim making process, which is one of the major aspects of today's presentation, is supposed to be pitched in a way that they should prove that they have been cultivating the forest plants before this particular date of claim making. The cutoff date is 13/12/2005, on which the bill was introduced in the parliament. So they have taken it as a cutoff date. So the Forest Department, Revenue Department, Tribal Development Departments, all these are working together for the first time ever under the Forest Rights Act for its implementation. So there is a vertical committee system, how Forest Rights Act gets implemented. Vertical committee system is upwardly responsible, as in the village level Forest Rights Committee and Gram Sabha. Gram Sabha is nothing but a congregation of all the citizens of at the village level and the local level. So the Gram Sabha and the village level Forest Rights Committee are responsible for receiving the claims and verifying the claims and then pushing them upwards to the district level, subdivisional level, district level, and the state level. So this is the process which goes on. But the fun part is that there are other forest management institutions that also coexist along with these present Forest Rights Act institutions, and that creates kind of an institutional bricolage. In one word, there is a lot of confusion and a lot of tension that comes into picture when one has to understand where to go, who is responsible for what and what not. So these are some of the realities of having new institutions getting created on top of the old institutions without specifying who does what and who should not do what. So some of the age-old committees, as I mentioned here in Indian languages, you can see one Sahebhagi committee or Jungle committee. These are simply forest rights committees of different eras. So joint forest management committees are very much coexisting along with all these forest rights committees. So now, what do we have in terms of our research methodology? What did we do? In a quick minute, we were taking care of our research needs using the qualitative ethnographic case study methods. We did some household schedules, we had in-depth interviews, we had focus group discussions, and we also had used the participatory rural appraisal methods such as transect walks and wealth rankings and seasonal rankings, etc. So we conducted our work study in 3 states, as I mentioned earlier, and we also did the selection of the study locale based on the feasibility and different factors that we have uniformly applied in all 3 cases. And then we have also tried to draw inferences which were analytically applicable to similar contexts. And we were very much dependent on the thick and thin observations while doing the immersion method. So lots of different exciting patterns we had come up with, but I'll be highlighting a few of those here quickly. So before I do that, if time permits, I'll quickly make a couple of points on the Indian history when it comes to forest policy. The first and foremost important aspect we need to understand is that the Indian forestry has its roots in the colonial times, when in 1894 and also in 1927, pre-independent India had given these forest acts, and these acts were definitely not totally friendly for the traditional forest dwellers, including the tribes and the non-tribes. Whereas the independent India also enacted some forest rights, like in 76, we had 42nd Amendment, which was very phenomenal. And also we had the Forest Rights Act of 1980, but both of these have taken their cues from the colonial policies. So they were not very much an improvement on top of what exists. So some kind of improvement was there, but then there was also a lot of control of the forest out of the hands of the forest dependent communities. So eventually in 1996, there was a Panchayati extension of Scheduled Areas Act, which actually directly gave a lot of power in the hands of the local people, who could then decide how they want their governance to happen and how they should be governed. So the joint forest management and community forest management interventions, which are very popular, on which I worked for my PhD in ISS in 2009. I passed out as the 100th PhD scholar, 100th defense. So the JFM CFM interventions kept on happening from 92 to 2004, but parallelly the Forest Rights Act, it's a very long name, I'm not reading it here, we can read it on the screen. The Forest Rights Act 2006, was kind of an improvement on top of all these aspects, and that is an improvement because it tried to kind of recognize the rights of the people that traditionally worked in the forest for their bona fide livelihoods. So the Forest Rights Act in itself is a very revolutionary, very forward-looking act. Now let's see some of the...
Sailaja, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So the quick findings and observations, as we discussed briefly earlier, the claim making process is very important, and the aspects of claim making are very much based on the capacities of different users. Some users had the proofs to submit for the claim making process. For example, a forest offender who had been fined could submit the fine received as a proof. But the same at the same level, some other person who was along with them who could not get the proof could not apply, even if they were the legitimate users of the forest. So there was institutional bricolage, I mentioned it already, and of course the JFM CFM lands, which were cultivated by the villagers from 1992 to 2004, have created lots of community-based organizations, collective organizations, and those collective organizations and those efforts could not be translated into collective forest rights claims because the technical glitch of the type of lands that were used by the JFM committee were not eligible for forest rights user granting the user rights. So technical difficulties deprived them of their rights. And of course, the migrants from neighboring states were always coming and fighting with these locals for new forest lands. So some of these aspects were very important. We could see that there was a lot of tension at the ground on all the three states. And some of the perspectives, one individual forest rights claimant is asking for the user rights, and at the same time saying that whoever do not have the proper proofs for the claim making are left out of this entire process of responsibilization, because now these people are suddenly responsible for proving their access rights or user rights to the forest. Earlier they were not. So, but then they say that they will continue to access the forest lands with or without the patta. Patta is the legal deed. And the JFMC members are also equally unhappy because they say we have worked hard for 3 decades and we saved these forests, and some other people are now coming and cutting these forests, and they have the proofs and they can get the benefits, and we do not have the ability to take the benefits. I apologize, that is a milkman who comes to fetch milk for us. My mother is helping me there. So we will move on the last slide. Some of the observations, I would say not all of them are probably accommodatable here. So what I'll do is I'll highlight 1 or 2. So basically the local politicians are banking on the individual forest rights and convincing the individual forest right holders that we will give you money because you have the access to the forests. We will give you the cash handouts. So some of these programs, popular programs, are really exacerbating the already existing pressure on the forest lands. New community members are picking up the sickle or anything they want and going in the night and clearing the forest. So this indiscriminate clearance is also becoming a big menace. So lots of conflicts are there. Official guidelines are not clear, and you have the institutional bricolage, which is also very confusing. So many different aspects are there, and the policy recommendations, definitely one or two again highlighting quickly, there must be a need for better coordination among different departments. And of course, you need to bundle some of the individual forest rights with some skill-based incentives, because even if people have forest lands in their possession, they do not have the skills or the ability to cultivate those forest lands. And the responsibilization process also comes in here, and people are not able to deliver because they are simply unable to deliver what is expected out of them out of blues. Okay, so the last point is definitely that the community forest rights and resource rights, habitat rights must be given a lot of impetus because that is where the forest can be protected in much more prominent manner or proper manner. And here is the last point, which says that, okay, now enough is enough. We need to have a deadline on receiving the individual forest right claims, because otherwise there is a continuous indiscriminate clearance of forest lands, which is affecting the health of the forest cover as well as the future of the forest dependent communities. So with that, I would just show the last slide of the team that worked with me for this particular project, and we are extending our work further. Thank you so much for the time. I hope I did not exceed too much.
Sailaja, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I am now going to pass it over to Hugh and then to Sunil to give us some comments on the two presentations, and remind everybody that if they have comments or observations, please write them into the chat and we will have a discussion subsequently. Thank you. Hugh, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marina, for this presentation, which is a very nice and detailed theoretical framework, it seems to me, to assess risk. But I was thinking of something more practical, and I would like you to reflect on that. When you talk about resilience and people being prepared for flood risks and the related health hazards that come with it, is there not also a role for education? Because in my international work, I've always emphasized that if you are in such a terrible situation that you are in a flood and you have no reliable drinking water, what people could relatively simply do is take a plastic bottle, which you can find everywhere, filter some water through cloth, fill the bottle and put it in the sun. And after a day in the sun, that water is bacteriologically safe. So you could even use that to give to your children. This is so-called solar disinfection. And this could be easily taught at school, even with examples of Petri dishes that you could show in a classroom. Look, if you put a drop of water from the roof, from the rain in the Petri dish, or you take something from your well, or you take something from a river, and you also take some from a bottle that has been exposed to solar, to ultraviolet radiation. And then children can see that the ultraviolet disinfection is extremely powerful and that the Petri dish remains clean. So if you would include that in education, or if you would have programs for the populace to actually learn this trick, then they would be better prepared for the eventuality. What do you think about that, Marina?
Hi, Hubert. Thank you so much for your comments. I think, like, as I have discussed it, I think these kind of risks, they are really intersectional and needs a systematic and holistic view. So for sure, education is a major part of this also. And for sure, we have to teach people on how to have access in an easy way and a different way of to water supply and this kind of stuff. So, but there is one problem that is about the boundary conditions of the institutional framework, institutional structure and political structure that we have for each location. So one of these problems is that the education in Brazil actually, it's also a major concern for our public policy. A lot of children, they don't actually go to school. And even in the school, you don't have the proper systems or labs to demonstrate this kind of stuff. Or even they don't have the time to do that, or a lot of children just go to school to eat. So this is kind of the problems that we have, and we have to think about the trade-offs and the boundary conditions of the most local, so fragile communities in terms of social fragility. So this, of course, it would be great, and I think we have to start thinking about this kind of little policies that we can apply in the different schools and try to do this. Here in Brazil, we have this expression, I don't know if you have it also, but like an ant work, that you do like little steps in each of the communities, but it's still like education is still a big like concern here for us, because even the great education system doesn't work really good in these social and fragile communities. But for sure, it's something that we need to start thinking about and how to implement this also. I don't know if I was clear in my answer.
Yes, thank you. It's clear. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, is this all right, Sarah?
Please.
Okay.
Do you have more observations?
Oh, well, I was thinking of a question for Sailaja.
Before we head into, could we have Sunil? He was going to provide comments.
Okay, all right, okay.
Then please put your question for Sailaja in the chat. Thank you.
Then
I appreciate it.
All right, good.
Dr. Sunil Tanka, please, we'd love to hear your comments on Sailaja.
Okay. All right. It's a very interesting presentation, and in a way, I'm a bit, let's say, torn between trying to give an academic style feedback on the research versus a more policy-oriented take on the phenomenon that's being studied. I'll keep my academic style comments to a minimum because I think they're relevant, but then I'll try to focus a bit more on the policy. So in order to understand a little bit better the situation that your research was conducted in, I think information, the ethnographic information that you referred to, needs to come out a bit more, because we're often talking about these forest dwellers and tribal communities, scheduled tribes, non-scheduled tribes, but we don't really know, because there are so many scheduled tribes in India, what their real ethnographic conditions are. These, from the photographs that you looked at, they didn't look like Adivasi tribal forest dwellers that we might be used to seeing. They seem to be, in a way, more settled. Perhaps their socioeconomic conditions aren't so desperate. So that kind of information would be really useful to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about these rights. And that, with that, I'm going to sort of segue into the whole policy and political angle of the creation, sort of an iterative creation of new rights, including what you referred to as some populist programs, and their relationship to two different entities here. One being the entity in terms of the traditional forest users, which could be these tribes or these villagers, but also in terms of the right of the forest itself as an entity, because there is a tension, regardless of how poor or marginalized these communities are, between their use and the forest itself in terms of the other non-human, let's say, inhabitants of the forest. And that's really important, especially if between the non-traditional users, so the more advanced outsider populations, which you also referred to, from those coming out of state. Of course, those state boundaries are a little arbitrary. Doesn't mean if just because someone comes from out of state, they might not be tribal. So, and of course, in India, the states There's a lot of politicking between outsiders and insiders, so I'm a little skeptical about the non-state people. But anyway, the issue is, well, what is the condition of the forest, and do these simultaneous and sequential accretion of new and new rights then lead to increased pressure on the forest? Because if there is, as you say, this bricolage of institutions and rights, it makes it very difficult for any kind of regulatory apparatus to function. So if you think about a forest department with its few forest guards who are anyway stretched thin because of budgetary limitations, if they have to make sense of all of these confusing rights and rules, then of course we're basically saying, giving carte blanche to all users to use the forest and degrade the forest. So partly I think the research would need to go into the effects on forest cover, and not just in terms of a satellite photo, but actually what's happening in ground with the other flora and fauna that's inside the forest demarcated areas, to understand what are the impacts of giving of these rights to, or new creation of these new rights. It might also be useful as follow-up study to see, do these new rights actually lead to some kind of socioeconomic benefit for the population? Because it could be that the new rights, you know, the marginal value of accessing the forest isn't a lot. And then the comment that you made at the end, that no matter whether the rights are given or not given, people are still going to use it. So what does that mean in terms of enforcement of forest regulation? Now, these are complex issues, and with the population pressures, the forests in India, especially in terms of not just cover of trees, but in terms of the biodiversity within them, are being threatened. And partly we need to start looking at how many of these rights can continue to be given, given this critical situation. So to sum up, I think we need a better understanding of the socioeconomic conditions of the communities that you have studied. We also need a better description of the ecological condition of the forests that you're studying, and then the evolution of these trends as you see. Let's say you can even take 2005 as your cutoff point for starting the study of the evolution, either through satellite photos or through other related research done on the ecology of the forest. I think, of course, you wouldn't be able to do that on your own, but if a consortium or a cooperative group of scholars could work on these sites together, then policy relevant material could be produced that would help protect, first of all, the forest, which has no real advocate for itself, as well as the more vulnerable parts of the groups that you're studying.
Thank you so much, Sunil. Hugh, do you want to ask your question before Sailaja responds?
Yes, well, it's maybe a short question, because I was wondering, I've more experience in Africa, but I've seen that also a lot of people who live on local resources like forest resources also sometimes overexploit the resources themselves. And what seems to me is that that is the pressure of poverty that does that, because in principle, people do not want to spoil their own resources. But sometimes their socioeconomic condition is so poor that they even destroy their own resources. Does this also come into your analysis?
May I respond to these questions?
Please, Sailaja. You
Okay,
may want
thank
to
you so much. Yes. I'll start with Hubert's question, because Professor Sunil's queries and suggestions are much more, they require more time. So I would go with Hubert's question first. And absolutely right, Professor Hubert, that there is a lot of pressure on limited resources, and the forests have not been the same, which also comes through lots of narratives that we have gathered from these forest dependent communities. They actually say very openly that the forests of 20 years back and the forests of today have absolutely no comparison at all when it comes to the kind of livelihoods they were able to draw from these forests 20 years back, and the and the meager livelihoods that they can gather from this forest of today. So there is a lot of pressure on the limited availability of resources, and also the, as Professor Sunil mentioned, the forest itself does not have any advocates there. So there is hardly any forest left. I keep on wondering how Indian government's estimates go up every now and then. The forest cover is going up and up and up. So there is a lot of discrepancy in what we see at the ground level and what we are told at the policy-based documentation level. So I would, with that, I hope that you are satisfied with that short answer. I would go into Professor Sunil's questions, where you will get more information. As he rightly pointed out, all that information is very much essential to make sense of this study and the findings that I presented briefly. Just because there was very limited time, I had to make a choice. No excuse, but I chose the things that I chose. So I really thank Professor Sunil for asking me these very important questions. Now I have a chance to give you the more detailed information. Really appreciate the questions and suggestions also. So let me go one by one. What are the community characteristics, or how the tribes are in these 3 states that we have visited? In Gujarat, which the pictures come from, most of the pictures come from Gujarat context, some pictures from Telangana. In West Bengal, we could not click pictures because they would not allow us to click pictures. Let me quickly explain how these tribes are in these 3 states. In Telangana, tribes are very much modern. They are very enterprising, and they are able to actually start taking the government application forms to make claims, and they put them in Xerox shops, and they buy the applications without depending on a government official. That's how advanced they are. So you could see them talking sometimes in broken English, and doing everything that a normal villager or normal town person does. So the tribes of Telangana are very much, in comparison to other places, are very advanced, I must say. And in Gujarat, the tribes of Gujarat are also very conducive to talk, and they have the ability to communicate in broken English and all those things. They know pizzas, they go to films, and they enjoy some kind of urban exposure every now and then when they have some cash in their hands. So Gujarat tribes are also very, so-called, advanced in one way or the other when we have this traditional notion. So where does this traditional tribal community member come from? I think I could say that the West Bengal tribes were this particular representation that we all have in our minds. How should a tribal person look? So those images would be more apt in West Bengal's context. So when it comes to comparison, the Gujarat and Telangana tribes people have more advanced, educational attributes and also some opportunities compared to the West Bengal Santals. West Bengal Santals are very backward in their orientation and approach. And also it was very difficult to communicate with those tribes people also. So there is a mixed experience when we have the community attributes when we talk about. Going by the second round of questions on populist programs like Raitu Bandhu, the traditional forest users were definitely frequented by the local politicians because they could convince the traditional forest users that because you have the user rights, you need help from us, and here we are with the cash handouts. So you can use this cash and then probably buy something that will be useful for the cultivation of your forest land. The reality is forest lands of these forest dependent communities were not given to them in terms of user rights, but the other type of forest lands which were not productive and not connected, well connected with the village surroundings. These forest lands did not have water resources available for cultivation purposes. So in many ways, these lands that were given for these communities were not exactly the same lands that they had claimed for. That is one aspect. The other aspect is the skill development was completely not prioritized by these politicians and local officials. In many ways, the skill development was not happening in these different tribes. And that also meant that even if you had an access to some distant forest land, you were not in number one a position to cultivate it or not access it on a daily basis and not derive a livelihood out of it. So this was all on paper. And the only thing they could do was follow the political leader or politician who were giving them the cash handouts. Simply because the politician is at least giving them some cash handout, they were happy with it. But the downside of that was, as Professor Sunil also mentioned, the forest itself was under a lot of threat because new people would come up with these so-called forest user right claim forms, because the politician has come and made a speech last month. He would say, we would try and give more and more cash handouts to new people also. So essentially, there are new claimants, whether they did have the user rights, bona fide traditional user rights or not, they're there with their filled up forms and asking for these forest rights. So there is this complete what our I think Sarah asked this question of how the perversive incentives are playing there. So I would say this is one of the major perversive incentive that was pushing the clearance of forest by unwanted people also. Now, the other 2-3 questions quickly I would want to address are the outsiders concept, the migrants from Chhattisgarh and other central Indian states coming and attacking the tribals of so-called the states that we were discussing with or we were approaching. So these migrant tribes were also being thrown out of their own homelands for some other political reasons. We all know in the Indian context, we know the extreme, what should I say, the Naxal politics are there, which push these people to leave their own states and go into other states for livelihoods. These are also tribes people only. They are known as Kondareddis and other Gotikoyas and other names are there. So these people also go to other states for livelihood purposes only. But the point that we should understand is they are coming and clearing the forests that the forest management committees have created for last 20-30 years, and there is no case being made by the people of this police of these 3 states. We asked a question, why is the police not making a case? And the police, the local panchayat and police people mentioned to us, if we make a case, we need to make an FIR, and an FIR would give them a proof of the forest clearance, and that would give them an access to claim form. So we don't want to actually acknowledge that there is clearance of forests, because if we acknowledge, we have to give them the claim form and redress their claim, in a more legalized manner. So very complicated kind of institutional bricolage is operating it, and the story is very complicated, as you would have understood. Now, regulatory apparatus and...
Sailaja, can I interrupt just briefly, because I'm conscious that we're getting close to time and there were a couple of questions for Marina. So maybe we can direct questions to Marina, and if we have more time, come back to, this extremely interesting point. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely, no problem.
So Marina, there are 2 questions. One from me just about how you've deployed the risk map with the authorities to begin to target policies or identify opportunities to have more harmonized policies. And another from a colleague from Al-Gemreji, please forgive me if I have your name wrong, who asks about flood insurance and the extent to which it may have been used or not, whether it's a popular mechanism. So we'd very much appreciate answers to those 2 questions if you have them.
Okay, Sarah, thank you. I will start about the flood insurance. This actually has been one of the research topics of another group that I also participate here in Brazil. And actually this flood insurance, they work better in areas, on commercial areas that have a lot of recurrence of floods. So for example, in another city here close to São Paulo, that's called São Carlos, the major commercial center of the city is in an area that is flooded almost every year, and it's like huge floods with a lot of economic losses. But since the population already is used to go to this spot to find everything that they want to buy, the commerciants don't leave this area. So it's like, even if they have the memory of the floods, and even if they know they are going to, they may be losing money from year to year due to the floods, they don't leave this area because it's already cultural. So for these areas, for this example of places, the flood insurance actually works fine, because it's like, we don't have actually good experience with flood insurance in areas, in residential areas, for example, where people can just like move out, or they don't have like enough incomes and enough economical winnings to pay for insurance. So in these cases, they usually don't pay another fee to actually be avoiding their losses, because they don't have the money. But in these commercial areas, actually this works fine. But one of the problems that we have in these commercial areas is that if we have like 5 years, like a short period of time without flooding events, people will just stop paying as well, because they will say, okay, so I'm not using the insurance, so it's not worth it to pay it. So it's actually kind of tricky, but we have some good experiences on that, on these areas. We hope actually that we didn't have this good experience, because it means that we have constant floods in those areas. But one of the major concerns that we are actually dealing in these areas now, where people actually pay for the insurance, is how to convert this money that is paid for the insurance in actions, in public actions to prevent the floods to happen. Because usually these flood insurances, they are private, they are from private corporations. So we actually need some kind of funding transference of these private companies to the public power, so that we can invest in risk management actions. So we can have the money to invest in these actions, because one of the problems that we have in Brazil as well is about funding. So if we can do this transfer of money, it would be really good. So this is one of the next steps that we are thinking about, how to do this funding transfer. That this is still something that we don't have the answer. And about the question of Sarah, actually, this work that I presented to you today is just beginning. So we have like 6 months since the beginning of the actually conceptualization of how we are going to do this flood risk map, considering the sanitation infrastructures. So we still didn't have a lot of talks with the authorities concerning the water, the flood, sanitation, and health nexus. But we have already done some other researches about the pathogens that we have encountered in flood water, and how this poses a threat to the population, and also about not only to pathogens, but also about some other emergent pollutants, such as metals and insecticides, I don't know, pesticides, something like this. Yeah, because here in Brazil, this is a major concern that we have as well. And actually what they are providing most for us now is monitoring of the data, and a continuous program of data monitoring, because this is still kind of, we don't have a lot of monitoring in sub-daily level. So this is the first step that we are going with them. And then we are thinking about expanding the policies for risk management. But here for the city of São Paulo, one of the good things is that they are doing now the climate change plan and the SDG adaptations for the city of São Paulo. And so we are trying to also identify the trade-offs and synergies in the SDGs, so this can be incorporated in the planning. But it's still on talking. We don't have a lot of experience by talking to the community, to the stakeholders and the public partners still in this point. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Marina. Sailaja, just thinking of Sunil's other observations, please. I think we have about 10 more minutes. We'll probably aim to close the seminar at about 11:15. Is that or 5:15 your time. Thank you so much.
I just need a couple of minutes more. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer some of the queries raised by Dr. Sunil. Of course, they require more time to go into depth. So the other couple of questions that I noted down are questions about how there are new rights leading to newer pressures on the pastures, forest lands. Definitely that is the case, that is happening everywhere in all these 3 states we have noticed. And we also noticed that the forest guards and forest officers are very vocal in criticizing this particular Forest Rights Act. By definition, they feel the ownership should lie with them, whereas the ownership now is being transferred slowly and steadily through different nomenclatures into the local people's hands. Of course, the fact remains that they only have the user rights. They do not have the rights to transfer or to sell or to lease the lands to other people. Even if a family has sons and daughters, they would have to inherit through a proper procedure for those user rights. So some of these processes
We appear to have lost Sailaja briefly. I think her internet may be unstable. Sailaja, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you appear to be frozen. I think while we wait for Sailaja to reconnect, were there any more comments for Marina? Observations? Oh, we seem to have lost Sailaja. Let's hope she will come back. Yes, wonderful. You are back. But you are on mute.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, I was thrown out for a couple of seconds. I had to come back yet again. Thank you for letting me in. Whoever did that, that was a big save. So quickly completing as I promised in 2 minutes. The effects on forest cover is devastating. The kind of lopsided implementation and the coupling of political interests and populist policies on top of these individual forest rights. It's not a good picture that we see at the grassroots. And it would be better if instead of pushing for individual forest rights, which are going to be beneficial for the populist policies of the politicians, we turn our attention towards the community forest rights, which would then be much healthier in terms of not only continuing the JFM, CFM culture that was propagated for last 2.5, 3 decades, and those bonds, community bonds, are now disintegrating because of this individualization and responsibilization on different levels. So we would, it would be ideal to see these processes, somewhere curtailed or somewhere, kind of turned back towards more community-based organization and community-based rights. And that is unfortunately not seem to be happening. More and more individual forest rights are given, and very few community forest rights are given in all these 3 states. So the future is a bit bleak for the Indian forests, that much we can say. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sailaja. Well, I'm mindful of the time and that I'm sure everybody else has other Zooms to go to. So I just want to thank you all very much for your time and your analysis and for sharing your papers, and thank our discussants for being so generous with their time. Thank you both. We will continue to have these seminars. We're probably aiming for at least one more before the end of the year. Dita has been incredibly kind in supporting this and really providing us with a lot of support to get this into being. So we are most grateful for her time and dedication and accompaniment. I think if you are interested, please reach out to your other ISS alumni colleagues and friends and say that this is happening. We think it's a potentially very useful forum for our alumni to share their work, to have an opportunity to sharpen their analysis and to network in a substantive way. So please encourage others to join. And I think we will continue with the environmental theme, and we're trying to seek more papers on environmental topics, but also ones that begin to sort of develop a more thoughtful analysis of the differentiation of claims making and rights as they play out in different contexts, and how communities respond to risk, and how public policy promotes resilience. So please reach out to your colleagues and see if there are others who want to share similar papers. And we will aim to have another seminar, I think, sometime in November. So thank you all so much for joining us. Dieter, I don't know if you want to say a few words to close, but...
No, I just wanted to thank you for all your efforts and energy to have these seminars. It's really great, and I'm sure it will take off more and more and more. Thanks so much. And thank you everybody, of course, for being present, and we hope to see you next time.
Super.
Thank you.
So much, everyone. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.